crying silently on a park bench in Central Park, holding her 3-year-old daughter against her chest. She told her whole life to a stranger she'd never seen before. She didn't know his name. She didn't know the scars on his hands came from a world most people only see in movies. She didn't know that when he walked into a room, powerful men stopped talking and feared for their lives. She just knew he was the first person in years who looked at her and asked if she was okay. Gianna Vale was 28, a single mother with nothing left. Her ex-husband had disappeared overnight, leaving behind an $80,000 debt to the kind of people who don't send letters, they send threats. They'd photographed her little girl at daycare. They'd followed her 19-year-old brother walking into NYU. She'd lost her job because these men showed up at the restaurant where she worked, and now the fridge was nearly empty. The rent was 2 months overdue, and she had 72 hours before everything she loved would be taken from her. She came to the park that October afternoon not to relax, but to breathe, to think, to find one reason not to collapse. And that's when he sat down. Nico Valenti, 36 years old, head of one of the most powerful crime families in New York, a man whose name made entire city blocks go quiet. He wasn't there by accident. Every year on this day, he came to the same bench where his mother used to read to him before she was murdered in front of his eyes when he was 14. He hadn't cried since that night. He hadn't let anyone close since that night. But when he saw this woman holding her child, tears streaming down her face, something he'd buried for 22 years cracked open, and he couldn't walk away. He sat down, kept his distance, and said 2 words that changed both their lives forever. What happened next will shake you to your core, because when she found out who he really was, she didn't run. And when the men who threatened her daughter came back, what Nico Valenti did wasn't justice. It was something far darker and far more terrifying. But here's the thing. It was also the most beautiful love story you'll ever hear, born in the last place you'd expect, between a broken mother with nothing and the most dangerous man in New York who thought he had everything but felt nothing until her. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who believes love shows up when you least expect it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because you don't want to miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that October afternoon in Central Park, to the moment Gianna Vale looked up through her tears and saw a man in a black suit sitting 3 feet away, staring straight ahead, saying nothing, as if he had all the time in the world. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, quickly, as if erasing them fast enough might keep the man from noticing that she had just been crying. But it was already too late. He had seen, and he was still sitting there. Gianna pulled Mia tighter against her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her sleeping daughter's breath, then turned to look at him for the first time, not with a furtive glance, but directly, with the gaze of someone far too tired to pretend to be polite. "Why do you care?" Her voice came out sharper than she wanted, almost rude. But she didn't have the energy to apologize. The man didn't frown. He didn't look offended. He tilted his head slightly to one side, as though weighing his answer, then spoke in a low, measured voice, not trying to sound gentle, but not cold either. "Maybe because you're crying alone with a kid and no one else gives a damn." Gianna blinked. She hadn't expected that kind of blunt honesty. Most people would have said something harmless, something like, "I hope you're okay," and then walked off, having done their duty to politeness. But this man didn't walk away. He didn't add anything else either. He simply sat there, both hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed ahead, on the row of trees turning color beneath the October afternoon light. The silence stretched on, not the kind of awkward silence that settles when 2 strangers sit too close together on a bus. This was something else, heavier, and yet, strangely, not uncomfortable, as if he were saying through his silence that she didn't have to say a word if she didn't want to, and he would still remain here. Gianna studied him from the corner of her eye. The black suit, tailored to perfection, the kind of fabric she used to see on the wealthiest guests back when she worked at the restaurant. And she knew that suit cost more than 6 months of rent for her apartment. The watch on his left wrist, black face, silver hands, not flashy, but carrying that kind of quiet luxury that didn't need a nameplate. Then she saw the scar, a faint line, paler than his skin, running from the back of his neck down beneath the collar of his suit, as if someone had dragged a blade along his spine a very long time ago. His hands had scars too, small marks across his knuckles, the kind of injuries people don't get from sitting behind a desk. His eyes were fixed on a distance that wasn't really distance at all. Not on the trees, not on the people passing by, but on something that wasn't here, something that had happened a long time ago and still hadn't loosened its grip on him. Gianna didn't know why she started talking. Maybe because he was a stranger. Maybe because she would never see him again. Maybe because she had held everything inside for too long and it was eating her alive from the inside out. And if she didn't tell someone right now, she would shatter right here on this stone bench. "My ex-husband was a gambler," she said softly, her eyes lowered to Mia's curly hair. "Not the kind who loses a few hundred at a poker night. The kind who borrows $80,000 from people who break bones for a living." She stopped, waiting for him to react, waiting for a shocked intake of breath or some useless advice. But he did nothing. He only listened. He disappeared. 6 months ago, just gone. Left me with his debt, his daughter, and a landlord who doesn't care about my sob story. Her voice trembled a little, but she forced it steady again. "I lost my job because they showed up where I worked, twice. Scared the customers. My boss said he couldn't risk it." Mia stirred in her lap, made a small sleepy sound, then drifted back under. Gianna kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of children's shampoo, the only scent left that could still keep her anchored to the earth. "And now they're watching us." Her voice was almost a whisper. "They took a photo of her, my daughter, at her daycare. Sent it to me like it was nothing. That was when she saw it. The shift, small, almost impossible to notice if she hadn't happened to be looking right at him." His jaw tightened, not much, just a slight movement beneath the skin, a muscle rising and then settling in an instant. But enough. Enough for Gianna to know that the last thing she had just said had touched something inside this man. Something deep and dark and very, very dangerous. He still didn't speak. Still looked ahead, but he wasn't looking far away anymore. He was here now, entirely here. And Gianna, though she didn't understand why, felt that for the first time in a very long while, someone was truly listening to her. Gianna didn't know how long she had been talking. The words kept pouring out of her like water bursting through a broken dam, out of order, with no attempt to make them neat or coherent. She told him about the sleepless nights spent combing through job listings, sending applications anywhere that was hiring, from grocery stores to dishwashing stations, and how every rejection carved another wound into the little confidence she still had left. She told him about the studio in the Bronx, where the hot water only ran for half the day, and the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbor coughing at night, where she was already 2 months behind on rent, and knew her landlord wouldn't wait for a third. She told him about Tommy, her younger brother, 19 years old. In his first year at NYU, on a partial scholarship, the smartest boy she had ever known, always believing his sister had everything under control, that somehow things were still being managed, because she had never once let him see otherwise. "He thinks I got it together," she said, giving a small laugh that held nothing joyful in it at all. "He calls me every Sunday, and I tell him everything's fine. Every single Sunday I lie to the only family I have left." The man still didn't interrupt. He didn't nod just to fill the space. He didn't look at her with pity. He simply sat there, taking in every word, every sentence. And Gianna had the strange feeling that he was weighing everything she said, not to judge her but to understand, to truly understand, as if it mattered to him, though she couldn't begin to fathom why. Then he spoke. For the first time in all the time she had been talking, he opened his mouth, and the question was so brief, Gianna almost missed it. "How much?" She blinked. "What?" "The debt. How much do you owe?" 80,000. He didn't react to the number. He didn't draw in a breath, didn't frown, didn't shake his head. $80,000. A sum that to Gianna felt like an entire mountain she could never climb over, seemed to be only a number to this man. Who's collecting? Gianna hesitated. It was the first time she had wavered since she started talking. To say the name of the man threatening her to a complete stranger on a park bench. But then she remembered the photo of Mia at daycare, remembered the text message, remembered the way they had shown up at the restaurant where she worked, and looked at her as if she were something they owned. She had already lost everything. What was left to protect? "A man named Frank," she said. And the world changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was only that the eyes of the man beside her turned darker, as though someone had pulled a curtain down behind his pupils, covering whatever softness she had glimpsed in him when he first sat down on this bench a few minutes ago. He knew that name. Gianna didn't need him to confirm it. She saw it in the way his jaw hardened, in the way his fingers curled slightly over his knee, and then stretched out again. Slow, controlled, as if he were restraining something that, if released, would become very, very bad. He rose to his feet. The movement was clean and decisive, not rushed but without hesitation. Gianna looked up at him, her heart beating faster without knowing why. He slipped a hand into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a card. Small, black, silver lettering. No logo, no title, no address, just a name and a string of numbers. He held it out to her, and Gianna noticed that his hand wasn't trembling at all, not even slightly, steady as stone. "Call me before your 72 hours are up," he said. "I'll handle it." Gianna looked at the card, then up at him. "Why?" One word, but it carried everything. "Why do you care? Why are you helping? Why would a man in a suit worth thousands of dollars stop for a single mother crying on a park bench?" Nico Valenti looked down at Mia. The 3-year-old was still asleep in her mother's arms, her tiny hand clutching a fold of Gianna's shirt, completely unaware of the world threatening to swallow her whole. He looked at the child longer than he had looked at anything else since sitting down on this bench. Because no child should pay for someone else's sins. Then he turned and walked away. His back straight, his steps even, never looking back. His figure blended into the stream of people, moving along the path through the park, past joggers and couples walking hand in hand and children laughing. And for a few seconds he was only a black suit in the middle of an October afternoon. Then he was gone completely. Gianna remained there alone, Mia still sleeping. The wind moved softly through the trees. She looked down at the card in her hand and realized her fingers were shaking. She read the name printed on it, read it again and again, and it stirred nothing except a vague, haunting feeling that something had just happened on this park bench that was far larger than anything she could understand in this moment. The bus ride back to the Bronx lasted 40 minutes, but Gianna couldn't remember a single one of them. She held Mia with one arm, while the other kept the black card tucked inside her coat pocket, her thumb brushing over its edge again and again as if she stopped touching it, it would disappear, and all of this would turn out to be a dream. When she got back to the studio on the 3rd floor, she pushed the door open with her shoulder, because both hands were occupied, laid Mia down in the small crib pressed against the wall, then opened the refrigerator. A pale yellow light spilled out, illuminating the emptiness inside. 1 can of children's formula, almost finished. Half a loaf of bread. A jar of peanut butter scraped nearly to the bottom. She made Mia's milk, waited for her to finish drinking, wiped her mouth, changed her into sleep clothes, and tucked the blanket around her. Mia yawned once, then closed her eyes almost immediately, with the careless sleep of a 3-year-old child who didn't know her mother was counting every hour. Gianna sat down on the floor beside her daughter's bed, leaned her back against the wall, and pulled out her phone. A crack ran diagonally across the screen from the left corner to the right, and she had been using it like this for nearly a year, because she didn't have the money to replace it. She opened the browser and typed 2 words into the search bar. Nico Valenti. The results appeared in less than a second, and Gianna wished she had never pressed the search button. The first result was an article from the New York Post from 4 years ago, the headline mentioning the Valenti family and connections to organized crime in New York, the kind of 5 families world she had only ever heard about in movies. The second result was a long analysis from an investigative newspaper, talking about this family's real estate empire, about the docks in Brooklyn that no one dared lease without the approval of one name, and that name was Valenti. The third result had photographs. Gianna saw him, the same face, the same dark eyes, but in this picture he wasn't sitting on a park bench. He was stepping out of a polished black car in front of a federal courthouse, lawyers on both sides, reporters all around him, and his face was so cold that Gianna couldn't connect it to the man who had looked at Mia with softened eyes just a few hours earlier. She kept reading. Every article mentioned violence. Not reckless violence, but something precise, calculated, the kind of violence that left no evidence because the evidence didn't exist, people disappearing without a trace, rival businesses burning in the night, witnesses withdrawing their testimony, and at the center of it all was Nico Valenti, 36 years old, heir to the empire from his father, Don Paolo Valenti, running it since he was 22, never convicted of a single charge even though the FBI had been trying for nearly a decade. Gianna turned the screen off. Her hand was shaking. She looked at the black card lying on the floor beside her knee, the silver letters glinting beneath the cheap fluorescent light of the studio. She wanted to tear it up, wanted to throw it in the trash and forget that this afternoon she had sat beside a mafia boss and told him everything about her life. She reached out, about to pick up the card and rip it in two, when her phone vibrated. A new message. An unknown number, the same one that had sent the photograph of Mia at daycare. She opened it, and the blood in her body turned to ice. It was a picture of her apartment door, the same door she had stepped through less than an hour earlier. Taken from the hallway outside, clear down to the room number and the patch of peeling paint at the bottom corner. Beneath the picture was a single line of text. Nice place. Thin door, though. Gianna stared at the picture, then at the door. The real door, right there, 3 steps away. The thin door she locked every night with a cheap latch that anyone could break open with one hard kick. They had been here, right outside. While she and Mia were inside, she bolted into the bathroom and retched. There was nothing in her stomach to bring up, so she only folded over the toilet, her stomach muscles twisting, tears streaming down her face without her being able to control them. She splashed cold water over her face, braced both hands on the sink, and looked into the mirror. The face looking back at her seemed older than 28. Hollow eyes, pale skin, cracked lips. She stepped back outside. Mia was still asleep, her tiny fingers still curled tightly around the corner of the blanket. Gianna looked at her daughter, then at the black card on the floor, then back at the fragile door. $80,000 of debt on one side, a mafia boss on the other, 2 devils, and she had to choose one. She called at 12:23 in the morning. Not because she had made a decision, but because she heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and heavy, stopping outside her apartment door for 3 seconds before moving on, and those 3 seconds were enough to make her understand that that thin door protected nothing at all. She pressed the number on the card with fingers trembling so badly she had to dial it twice. The phone rang 3 times. "This is Gianna, from the park." Half a second of silence on the other end. Then his voice came through, not sleepy, not surprised, calm as if he had been expecting this call ever since he walked away from that park bench that afternoon. "I know. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I'll send you the address." Then he hung up. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask what had happened. Just one clipped instruction, and the dead hum of the line. Gianna stared at the darkened screen, then at the message with the address that appeared 3 seconds later. An address in Midtown Manhattan. She set the phone down and lay beside Mia, but sleep didn't come. She lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the pipes dripping from the floor above, listening to the distant cry of an ambulance somewhere out on the street, listening to the steady breathing of her 3-year-old daughter beside her, and thinking about $80,000, about Frank, about the photograph of the door, about the man on the park bench with the scar at the back of his neck, and the way his eyes had darkened when he heard Frank's name, about the articles, the deaths, the people who vanished. Her hand still held the card, clenched tight in her palm all night, and when the sky began to lighten, she opened her hand and saw that the edge of the card had pressed a deep red line into her skin, sharp as a knife mark. She placed the black card carefully on the edge of the sink, ensuring not a single drop of water would touch the silver lettering, before stepping into the shower. She got up at 6. Mia was still asleep. Gianna stepped into the bathroom, no bigger than a closet, turned on the faucet, waited 30 seconds for the water to warm, then showered quickly. She stood in front of the wardrobe with both doors open, looking at the few clothes hanging inside. She chose the white blouse, the only one that still looked decent, even though the collar was beginning to fray, and the second button from the bottom had been sewn back on with thread that didn't match. Black pants, the only pair whose knees hadn't faded. Black flats, the only shoes she owned that weren't torn, though the soles were so worn she could feel every pebble beneath her feet when she walked. She stood before the small bathroom mirror and looked. The face staring back at her was still tired, still ringed with dark circles beneath the eyes, still marked by a fear she couldn't hide no matter how hard she tried. But there was something else there this morning. In her eyes, not hope, not yet, but something close to resolve. The look of someone who had already hit bottom and knew that wherever the next step led, it couldn't be worse than standing still. She carried Mia to the apartment next door and knocked softly. Mrs. Patricia Webb opened the door, 68 years old, silver hair pinned high, floral robe on, eyes kind but sharp. She was the only person in this building who had ever helped Gianna without wanting something in return, the one who watched Mia whenever Gianna had to go to a job interview, the one who quietly left cans of formula outside her door and pretended she knew nothing about it. "I need a few hours," Gianna said. "I have a meeting, Mrs." Webb looked her up and down, took in the freshly pressed clothes, the red eyes hollowed out by lack of sleep, and asked nothing more. She simply held out her arms for Mia. "Take your time, honey." Gianna kissed Mia on the forehead, whispered into her little ear that Mommy loved her, then stepped back into the hallway, pulled the door closed, and stood there for 1 second, breathing in, breathing out. Then she went, down 3 flights of stairs, through the front door of the old building, out onto a Bronx street already stirring with buses and horns, and the smell of coffee from the shop on the corner. She walked 4 blocks to the subway station, swiped a Metro card that was nearly out of money, stepped onto the southbound 6 train, toward Manhattan, toward the glass tower in Midtown, where the most dangerous man she had ever met was waiting for her. She stood in the crowded train car, one hand gripping the pole, the other wrapped around the black card inside her coat pocket, and she didn't know whether she was moving toward salvation or toward the edge of an abyss, but she was moving, and today, that alone was enough. The building didn't look like anything she had imagined. There was no skull emblem, no iron gate, nothing that screamed this was the operational center of a crime family. It looked like a high-end real estate company, its blue glass facade reflecting the Manhattan sky, a small, elegant logo etched into the stainless steel revolving door, the kind of building Gianna would pass every day without ever thinking of stepping inside. She stood on the sidewalk across from it for nearly 2 minutes before crossing the street. The people moving along the block were all dressed in finely tailored suits, polished leather shoes, briefcases in hand, phones pressed to their ears, walking with the quick, assured stride of people who knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they were worth. Gianna looked down at her worn flats and almost turned back toward the subway station. But she didn't. She stepped through the revolving door, and the world changed. Inside the lobby, everything was quiet in a way that felt unsettling. Black marble floors, gray walls, decorative greenery placed with precision so exact it seemed measured down to the last inch. A long black granite reception desk with 2 people seated behind it, beautiful and cold as statues. But the first thing Gianna noticed wasn't the luxury. It was the men. They stood at every corner, dressed in suits, tiny, nearly invisible earpieces tucked near their ears, their eyes sweeping over her the moment she walked in, and assessing her in less than a second. Not corporate staff, bodyguards. Cameras were everywhere, small, discreet. But she noticed them because she had learned to notice everything, ever since people started watching her. She felt so out of place it was almost laughable. The blouse with the fraying collar, the button sewn back on with mismatched thread, the worn shoes, all of it in the middle of a place where even the doorman looked more expensive than everything she owned put together. She didn't belong here. Every cell in her body knew it. "Gianna Vale?" The voice came from her right. She turned and saw a woman approaching, around 40 years old. Black hair cut just to the shoulders. A sharp face with high cheekbones and brown eyes that missed nothing. She wore a dark gray suit, no jewelry except a small-faced watch, and moved with the bearing of someone accustomed to controlling every room she entered. "I'm Carla Montero. Follow me." No handshake, no smile, no asking whether the trip had gone well. She simply turned and walked, assuming Gianna would follow. And Gianna did. Through the lobby, past the bodyguard's watchful eyes, into a private elevator that Carla opened with a key card. The doors slid shut, and Gianna caught her reflection in the polished steel wall. She looked small, frightened, out of place, but she was still here. The elevator stopped at the top floor. The doors opened onto a wide hallway. White walls, abstract paintings hung at even intervals, soft light spilling from recessed fixtures overhead. At the end of the hallway stood a dark oak door, no nameplate, no room number. Carla knocked once, then opened it without waiting for an answer. "She's here." Then she stepped aside. Gianna walked in, and the room swallowed her whole. Not because it was large, though it was, but because of the air inside it. The curtains were half drawn, filtering the light into muted gold bands across the dark wood floor. The furniture was all black and deep brown, bookshelves running along one wall, an enormous walnut desk at the center, 2 black leather chairs facing it. The scent of oak and whiskey lingered in the air, faint but impossible to ignore, the smell of old money and silent power. Behind the desk, floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto the full sweep of Manhattan, the skyline like a row of silver teeth beneath the morning sun. And Nico Valenti was standing there, in front of the glass, his back to her. Black suit, no tie, one button of his shirt left open at the collar. When he heard her step inside, he turned and rose to meet her. Not rose because he had been sitting, but in the way he turned fully toward her, tipped his head slightly, and waited for her to come closer, without stepping forward to overpower her. A small gesture. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Gianna noticed, because she had lived long enough with a man who never stood for her, never held a door, never looked at her as if she deserved respect. "Sit down," Nico said, his voice even, one hand motioning toward the leather chair across from the desk. Gianna sat. He sat opposite her. Between them stretched the broad walnut surface, holding nothing except a glass of water already poured on her side and a cup of espresso on his. She looked at the water, then up at him, and waited. He looked back at her. Unhurried, not speaking right away. And in those few seconds of silence, Gianna understood that whatever was about to be said in this room would decide everything. "Frank Del Vecchio," Nico said, and the name fell from his mouth like something foul-smelling he was forced to touch. "I know him. Better than you think." Gianna said nothing. She sat with her back straight in the leather chair, both hands resting on her lap, waiting. Nico took a sip of espresso, then set the cup down, slow and exact, every movement under control, as if he had never done anything hurried in his life. "He used to work for my family, years ago. Low-level, collections, the kind of dirty work nobody wants but somebody's gotta do." He paused, his eyes looking past her, toward something farther away than the wall behind her. But Frank had a problem. He liked power too much. Started running his own loan operations on the side, charging interest rates that'd make a bank blush. And when people couldn't pay, he didn't just threaten them. Silence. He went after their families. Gianna felt a chill travel down her spine. She knew exactly what he meant because she was living it. "I found out," Nico continued, his voice flat, without emotion, as if he were reading from a financial report. "Gave him one warning. He didn't listen, so I cut him off. Removed him from every operation, every contact, every protection the Valenti name provides. That was 4 years ago." He looked straight into her eyes. "Frank Del Vecchio is running his little empire on borrowed time. He's got no backing, no muscle worth a damn, and no protection. The only reason he's still in business is because I haven't considered him worth my attention. Until now." Gianna swallowed hard. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the $80,000 your ex-husband owed him. It's gone. I'll wipe it. Not a loan, not a favor you'll owe me later, not a trade. Gone." She blinked. $80,000. Erased. Just like that. "In exchange," Nico said, and Gianna felt her whole body tense because here it was. Here was the price. Here was the moment she would find out what he really wanted. "You come work for me." She stopped breathing. "I own a restaurant in Soho, Fontana. Italian, high-end, legitimate business. Tax records clean, health inspections perfect, everything above board. I need someone to manage front of house, someone who knows how to deal with people, handle pressure, think on their feet. From what you told me yesterday, you've done that your whole life." Gianna opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had prepared herself for everything, prepared herself to be forced into something illegal, prepared herself to have to refuse something disgusting, prepared herself to run from this room. She had not prepared herself for a legitimate job offer. Real salary, real contract, benefits. "You'd report to Carla, the woman who brought you up here. She runs the day-to-day." He leaned back in his chair. "That's the deal." "I don't understand," Gianna said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended, because suspicion had sunk too deep into her bones to be erased by an offer that sounded too good. "I've read about you. I know what you do, what your family does. So why would you do this for me? What's in it for you?" Nico didn't frown. He didn't look offended. He looked at her, and Gianna saw something shift behind his dark eyes, quick, almost too quick to catch, like a light flashing once in a dark room and then vanishing. "I'm not a good man, Gianna." He didn't say it to impress her. He didn't say it to threaten her. He said it the way a man states a fact he has lived with too long to feel anything about anymore. "I've done things that'd keep you up at night. Things I won't apologize for. That's who I am." He paused. "But I have rules. And the first rule is you don't use a woman's child to threaten her. You don't go after kids. You don't touch what can't fight back." His voice didn't rise, but Gianna could feel the weight behind every word, like stones dropping into deep water. My mother was killed when I was 14, he said, and the room changed. The air thickened. The light filtering through the curtains seemed darker. She was holding me when it happened. I felt her arms go limp around me before I understood what the sound was. I was 14, and I was covered in my mother's blood, and I couldn't do anything. Silence. Not polite silence. Heavy silence. The kind that had weight, pressing against Gianna's chest until she forgot to breathe. I couldn't save my mother. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had walked into this room, his eyes weren't cold. Not warm exactly, but there was something there. Deep, wounded, real. But I can make sure no one uses your daughter against you. That I can do. Gianna sat still. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked at the man across from her. And she didn't see a mafia boss. She didn't see a killer. She saw a 14-year-old boy holding his mother and unable to do anything. She didn't trust him. Not yet. Maybe she never fully would. But she understood him. And sometimes understanding is enough to keep moving even when trust isn't there. Okay, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. I'll do it. Nico nodded once. He didn't smile. He didn't say good or welcome. He only nodded, as if he had known her answer before she spoke, not out of arrogance, but because he understood that when you are standing at the edge of an abyss and a hand reaches out, you take it, no matter whose hand it is. Everything happened faster than Gianna could have imagined. She had barely risen from the leather chair, barely shaken Carla Montero's hand, and taken the folder containing the employment contract Carla had already prepared, as if everything had been decided before she ever set foot in the building. When Nico picked up the phone on his desk, he didn't look at her when he made the call, didn't look at anyone. His eyes stayed lowered to the walnut surface, one hand holding the phone, the other resting flat on the desk, fingers not tapping, not trembling, completely still. He spoke in Italian. Gianna didn't understand Italian, but she didn't need to understand the words to understand the tone. It was calm. Calm in a way that made her skin crawl. It didn't rise, didn't fall, didn't sharpen on any particular word, just a steady flow of sound that somehow felt more frightening than any scream she had ever heard Derek let loose when he was drunk. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Nico set the phone down, then looked toward the corner of the room where a man had been standing motionless since the moment Gianna walked in, though she hadn't noticed him until now. Tall, solid, dark-skinned, with a face as expressionless as a brick wall, wearing a black suit and a nearly invisible earpiece. Nico said only one sentence in English. Ray. Handle it. The man named Ray Santos nodded once, then disappeared through a side door Gianna hadn't even known was there. He didn't ask a single question. Didn't need an explanation. As if those 2 words contained every instruction he required. Carla placed a hand on Gianna's shoulder, light but firm. I'll walk you out. You start Monday. Gianna looked at Nico one last time before leaving the room. He had already turned away, standing before the wall of glass, looking out over Manhattan, phone in hand, and she knew that as far as he was concerned, the part involving her was finished. The rest belonged to his world, and she didn't belong in it. Not yet. Carla escorted her down to the lobby, handed her a small envelope containing information about Fontana, her schedule, and a brand new employee card with her name printed on it. Everything had been prepared, as if Nico Valenti had never once doubted she would say yes. Gianna stepped out onto a midtown street, sunlight striking her face, horns and voices and the rush of the city all around her, and she stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, holding the envelope against her chest, trying to understand that this morning she had boarded the subway with $80,000 of debt hanging over her head, and now she was standing here with an employment contract and a promise that everything would be taken care of. She got back to the Bronx a little before 1 in the afternoon, picked Mia up from Mrs. Webb's apartment, thanked her, then returned to the studio. The afternoon passed slowly. She fed Mia, played with her, read to her, tried to live through an ordinary afternoon, while everything inside her was still spinning. At 7 in the evening, Mia fell asleep. At 8, Gianna sat on the floor beside her daughter's bed, her back against the wall, staring up at the ceiling. At 9:17 that night, Ray Santos stepped through the door of Nico's office on the top floor of the Midtown building. Gianna wasn't there to see it, but if she had been, she would have seen the small spot of blood on the cuff of Ray's white shirt, right where the wrist met the palm, as if he had gripped something, or someone, far too tightly. Nico looked at the blood, didn't ask. Ray didn't explain either. He only nodded once. Done. At 10:20 that night, Gianna's phone vibrated. A message from a number not in her contacts. The debt has been settled. No one will contact you again. Gianna read the message. Read it again. Read it a third time. $80,000. The sum that had been pressing on her chest for 6 months. The sum that had cost her her job, her sleep, her weight, nearly her home. Gone, in a matter of hours, with one phone call and 2 words. She didn't know exactly what had happened to Frank Del Vecchio that night. Didn't know what Ray Santos had said, what he had done, what threats he had made. She only knew that from this moment on, no more photographs arrived, no more midnight messages, no more shadows standing outside her door. Frank was still alive. She assumed so. Nico had said Frank hadn't crossed the final line yet, and she understood that in Nico Valenti's world, that final line was the kind you never stepped back from once you crossed it. Frank had been warned, forced to erase the debt, humiliated before the underworld, but he was still breathing. That was Nico's mercy, and it was more terrifying than any punishment, because it meant he had chosen to let Frank live, and that power, the power to decide who lived and who didn't, was what sent cold running through Gianna's bones. She set the phone down, looked over at Mia. Her little girl lay curled beneath the blanket, arms wrapped around the small teddy bear whose stuffing had gone thin, lips slightly parted, breathing evenly. Gianna pulled the blanket up over her daughter's shoulder, smoothed a hand over her curls, and sat there for a long time without moving, just listening to her breathe. For the first time in months, she drew in a breath without feeling her chest seize. For the first time in months, the air truly filled her lungs, deep and full. And when she let it out, what left her body with that breath wasn't only carbon dioxide, but 6 months of fear, 6 months of sleepless nights, 6 months of seeing her phone light up and wanting to hurl it against the wall. She didn't cry. She had cried enough already. She simply sat there beside her daughter, in that tiny studio in the Bronx, and breathed. Fontana didn't have a large sign, only a small bronze plaque, no bigger than a hand, mounted beside the heavy oak door, engraved with a single word in a font so thin you had to stop and tilt your head to read it. It was the kind of restaurant where, if you needed help finding it, you didn't belong there. Gray stone facade, no windows facing the street, no menu posted outside, nothing at all except the wooden door and the bronze plaque, and the confident silence of a place that knew its guests would find their own way. Gianna stood in front of that door at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, 30 minutes early, because she'd rather wait outside than arrive late on her first day. She was wearing the same outfit she had worn when she met Nico, because she didn't own another one, but this time she had washed and pressed it more carefully, and sewn the mismatched button back on with black thread in the proper shade. Carla Montero opened the door at exactly 8:30, saw her standing there waiting, said nothing about her arriving early, only nodded and stepped inside. Gianna followed. Inside, Fontana was beautiful in a restrained way. Terracotta tile floors, walls washed in warm cream plaster, brass hanging lamps casting a soft golden glow, dark wood tables dressed in crisp white linens, and a long gray marble bar running the length of one wall. Everything spoke of money, but never loudly. Carla didn't waste time. She began at once, leading Gianna through every section, from the kitchen where the head chef was inspecting the morning ingredients, down through the wine cellar in the basement, and into the records office in the back, a room no bigger than a closet, but organized down to the last sheet of paper. She explained the reservation system, the list of VIP guests Gianna needed to know by face and by name, how to contact suppliers, how to handle complaints, how to say no in a way that still made people feel respected. Carla was strict. She didn't repeat anything twice, and expected Gianna to be the same. She didn't ask whether Gianna understood. She asked, "Repeat that back to me." Then waited, and if Gianna missed even one detail, she corrected it immediately, brisk and direct, never cruel, but never comforting either. But she was fair. When Gianna asked an intelligent question about how staff should be divided between the lunch shift and the evening shift, Carla paused for half a second, looked at her, then gave a slight nod. It was the highest praise Gianna received all day, and she knew it was worth more than any good job. Gianna adapted faster than she had expected. Her 2 years at her old restaurant began to matter. Even though Fontana was in an entirely different world, she knew how to read a room, knew what a table needed before anyone called for it, knew how to handle an irritated guest who had waited too long without making the situation worse. When a difficult regular complained that the wine wasn't at the right temperature, Gianna handled it with calm and a smile that was just enough without being submissive, and the man left with a fresh bottle and a promise to come back. Carla stood at the bar watching the whole thing without saying a word. At lunch break, Gianna sat on a small chair beside the kitchen window, where the light came through frosted glass and the clatter of pots and pans formed a strange but soothing kind of music. She looked out into the narrow alley behind the restaurant, saw the slim patch of blue sky between two brick walls, and thought that exactly 1 week ago she had been sitting on a bench in Central Park, crying with her 3-year-old daughter in her arms, having no idea what tomorrow would bring. And now she was sitting here, in this restaurant, with an employment contract in her bag and the debt gone. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Grateful, frightened, suspicious. All three at once, maybe. At the end of the day, while Gianna was putting the records in order the way Carla had shown her, she heard the front door open. She didn't look out, but she felt the shift in the air of the restaurant, the way the kitchen staff went a little quieter, the way Carla set her pen down and stood a little straighter. Nico walked in. She saw him through the gap in the office door, the familiar black suit, the even stride, his eyes sweeping quickly across the restaurant before stopping on Carla. He didn't look toward Gianna, didn't ask about her, didn't come into the room where she was sitting. He only spoke to Carla in a low voice, and Gianna caught only a few words through the half-open door. "How is she?" Carla answered in a voice as flat as a tabletop. "Stubborn. Doesn't ask anyone for help. Figures everything out on her own." A beat of silence. Then Gianna heard something she almost didn't believe. A small sound, nearly non-existent, escaping from Nico Valenti. Not a laugh, only a breath a little heavier than usual, the kind that came close to a smile without ever truly becoming one, the kind made by a man who had forgotten how to smile a long time ago but still vaguely remembered what it felt like. Good. 3 weeks passed, and Gianna began to breathe to a new rhythm. Her first paycheck landed in her account, and she stood in a grocery store in the Bronx for nearly 10 minutes just staring at the shelf of children's formula, because for the first time in half a year she could buy 2 cans instead of counting down the last one. She paid this month's rent on time, called her landlord, and said, "The rent's been sent," in a calm voice she had practiced in front of the mirror 3 times before she could say it without shaking. She sent Tommy money through Venmo, $300, with the message, "For books and food, don't argue," and Tommy called back immediately asking what kind of job she had found that left her with extra money. Gianna told him she was managing an Italian restaurant in Soho, heard Tommy let out a shout of excitement on the other end, and she laughed with him even though her stomach tightened, because the rest of the story was the part she would never tell. At Fontana, she found her rhythm. Carla was still strict, but she began handing Gianna more responsibility, from handling VIP reservations to coordinating the evening staff, and Gianna took it all in like a thirsty woman standing before running water. She was good at this. She knew it, and Carla knew it too, even though she never said it out loud. Then there was Nico. He started coming to Fontana more often. The first week, only once, at the end of the day, talking to Carla and then leaving. The second week, twice. By the third week, almost every day, and not always with any clear reason. Sometimes he sat at the bar for 20 minutes, drank a single espresso, then left. Sometimes he stepped into the kitchen and spoke to the head chef in Italian, his voice completely different from the one he used in English. Softer, more musical, almost warm, Carla noticed. Gianna saw her glance at Nico, then at her, then look away without saying anything, though the corner of Carla's mouth lifted in a way Gianna couldn't tell was a smile or a warning. Ray Santos noticed too. Gianna caught him standing near the restaurant door one afternoon, his eyes following Nico as he walked toward the bar where Gianna was checking the reservation book, and on Ray's usually expressionless face there was something close to surprise. Their conversations were brief, and they always began with work. Nico asked for her opinion on the new menu. She told him plainly that the appetizers offered too many choices and customers would waste time deciding instead of ordering quickly. He looked at her for 2 seconds, then said, "Cut it to 5, and the head chef nearly dropped a pan. He asked what she thought about the weekend crowd. She told him Saturday revenue was strong, but Friday was weak, because the cocktail menu wasn't varied enough for younger guests, and he nodded, and the next week the bar had 4 new cocktails. She spoke plainly. No flattery, No dancing around the point, no saying what she thought he wanted to hear. And he listened, truly listened. Gianna began to notice the small fragments, not the large ones, not stories or confessions, only gestures. The way Nico slipped an extra envelope of tip money into the cleaning staff's locker when he thought no one was watching. The way he stood whenever she entered a room. Every time, without missing once. A small gesture she wasn't sure he even did consciously, or whether it was simply a habit his mother had taught him when she was still alive. The way he said, "Grazie," to the 17-year-old kitchen assistant, in the same gentle tone he used with millionaire guests. Small pieces of light. Only small ones. But she saw them. Then came that night. Wednesday, nearly 11. Gianna stayed late to finish the books after the last employee had gone home. The restaurant was dark and quiet, with only the bar lights still on because she hadn't turned them off yet. She heard the front door open and knew it was him before she ever looked up. Nico walked in, but not the Nico she had gotten used to seeing. His suit was disheveled, his shirt collar wrinkled, and along the left side of his jaw there was a bruise already turning dark purple, plain beneath the bar lights. He didn't explain, didn't say hello. He only sat down on the bar stool at the far end of the counter, both hands resting on the marble, staring straight at the line of liquor bottles arranged on the shelves before him. Gianna didn't ask. She didn't know why she didn't ask. Maybe instinct. Maybe because she understood that this man didn't need questions. He needed someone who wouldn't ask them. She stepped behind the bar, took the bottle of Macallan from the top shelf, poured 2 fingers into a tumbler, set it in front of him, then poured herself a glass of water and sat down 3 stools away. She said nothing. Nico picked up the glass, took a drink, and set it back down. Silence. But not heavy silence. This was the kind of silence neither of them needed to fill. The rare kind that exists between 2 people who haven't known each other long enough to deserve sitting quietly together without discomfort, and yet somehow it existed between them as naturally as breathing. Gianna didn't know how long they sat like that. 10 minutes. Maybe 20. Then Nico's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen, his jaw tightening, stood, and walked out through the front door. The door closed, but not all the way, and his voice carried back through the narrow opening. Gianna didn't try to listen, but that voice didn't give her a choice. Cold, sharp, each word falling like a loaded bullet. He gave orders in English this time, short and precise, and even though Gianna didn't understand the full context, she heard enough to know that somewhere, someone, tonight, was going to regret something very, very deeply. He came back inside, slipped the phone into his pocket, and looked at her for 1 second. "Thank you for the drink," he said, his voice normal again, as if the call had never happened. Then he left. Gianna remained there alone in the dark restaurant. The unfinished whiskey sat on the counter, the warmth where his hand had held the glass not yet cooled on the surface, and she remembered. He wasn't an ordinary man. He wasn't a polished gentleman stopping in for a late-night whiskey. He was Nico Valenti. And even if he stood whenever she entered a room, even if he slipped money into envelopes for the cleaning staff, even if he sat beside her in the dark as though it were the safest place in the world, 10 minutes earlier he had given an order for something she didn't want to know. The next morning, Gianna arrived at Fontana on time. When Nico came by that afternoon, she greeted him with a short nod, instead of the usual, "Good afternoon." She answered his questions in 3 or 4 words, instead of the long, direct replies he had grown used to. She avoided his eyes. Nico noticed. Gianna knew he noticed because he paused in the middle of a sentence for 1 beat, looked at her, and she saw that he understood. But he didn't ask, didn't press, didn't explain. He only gave a slight nod, turned away, and left the restaurant earlier than usual. And that, Gianna thought as she watched the door close behind him, was perhaps the most frightening thing about Nico Valenti. Not the cold phone call, not the bruise along his jaw, but the way he watched her retreat and didn't follow. Because only a truly dangerous man is patient enough to wait. "Mrs. Patricia called at 6 o'clock in the morning, her voice rough with the flu, saying she was sorry but she couldn't watch Mia today, that she was coughing so hard she could barely stand and didn't want to pass anything on to the little girl. Gianna told her to rest, that it was all right. She would figure something out, then hung up and stood in the middle of the studio looking at Mia sitting on the floor, trying to force her foot into a shoe she had put on backward. She had no one else, no relatives in New York, no close friends she could ask to watch her daughter, no money to call a babysitter at the last minute. She called Carla, keeping her voice as steady as she could. explained the situation, and asked for permission to bring Mia along. 2 seconds of silence on the other end. Then Carla said, "Bring her. Keep her quiet. Don't make it a habit," and hung up. Gianna let out a breath, dressed Mia, stuffed crayons and paper into her bag, then carried her daughter onto the subway to Soho. When they reached Fontana, she apologized to Carla again, promised Mia would sit still, and Carla only looked at the little girl hiding behind her mother's leg and said, "Corner table, away from the kitchen," in a stern voice, though her eyes were a little softer than usual. Gianna settled Mia at the table in the far corner of the restaurant, away from the service area, spread white paper and crayons out in front of her. "Draw me something beautiful, okay? Mama's gotta work." Mia nodded, picked up a red crayon, and began drawing something that was probably a cat, or a cloud, or both at once. And Gianna went back to work, glancing toward her daughter every few minutes just to make sure she was still all right. The lunch shift passed without any trouble. Mia sat still with a patience that was astonishing for a 3-year-old, completely absorbed in coloring, sometimes looking up to show a picture to the kitchen assistant passing by before bending back over her paper again. Then Nico came in, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She heard the door open, felt the familiar shift in the rhythm of the restaurant when he stepped inside, and kept working at the host stand without looking up. She was still keeping her distance after that night, after the whiskey and the cold phone call, and she thought he would go straight to Carla or into the kitchen the way he usually did, but he stopped. Gianna looked up and saw Nico standing in the middle of the restaurant, his eyes fixed on the corner table where Mia was sitting. He stood completely still, not the kind of pause a man makes in passing, but the kind where his whole body truly stops, as if his feet had decided before his mind had time to catch up. Mia looked up. 3 years old, didn't read newspapers, didn't know what the Valenti family was, didn't know where the scars on the man's hands had come from. She only saw a grown-up standing near her table, and she did what any 3-year-old would do when faced with someone interesting. She looked straight into his eyes and said, "You're tall." Nico Valenti. The man New York feared, the man whose name could silence an entire street, the man who hadn't let anyone close for 22 years, looked down at the curly-haired 3-year-old sitting in the middle of a scatter of crayons and scribbled napkins and said, "Yeah, and you're small." Mia laughed, the kind of laugh only children have, loud, clear, hiding nothing at all. Then she picked up a blue crayon and held it out to him with all the seriousness of someone offering a sword. "Draw," she said. It was an order, not a request. And Nico Valenti, a man who took orders from no one alive, pulled out a chair and sat down. He took the blue crayon, and the hand that had signed commands Gianna didn't want to think about began to draw on the paper napkin. A house, crooked, the roof tilted to one side, the windows uneven, the chimney looking as though it might collapse. So clumsy it was almost funny. Mia clapped her hands. "It's a house," she cried, then grabbed a red crayon and drew a sun above the crooked house, almost as big as the whole thing, with rays stretching out in every direction. Nico looked at the drawing, then at the little girl, and on his usually expressionless face, there was something Gianna had never seen before. Not a smile. Something closer, softer, something that had been locked away for a very long time trying to find its way out. Gianna stood 6 steps away behind the host stand, and tears rose into her eyes before she could stop them. Not because she was sad, because Derek, Mia's father, the man Gianna had once loved enough to have a child with, had never once sat down and drawn with his daughter. Not once. In 3 years. Not once. And here was a stranger. A mafia boss. A man she had been trying to keep her distance from, because she was afraid of him, sitting in a restaurant chair drawing a crooked house in blue crayon for her little girl, not because of Gianna, not to impress her, not to get anything in return, only because a child had handed him a crayon and said, "Draw," and he had sat down. Gianna turned her face away, blinking quickly, wiping at the corner of her eye with the back of her hand before anyone could notice. But the wall she had built over the past days, the defensive wall, the wall of fear, the wall that kept reminding her he was dangerous, that she had to keep her distance, that wall had truly cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a man drawing a crooked house for a 3-year-old girl. And sometimes, that alone is enough to break everything open. 2 days after that afternoon when Mia drew with Nico at Fontana, Gianna got a message from his number at 7 in the evening. "Can you come to the office tonight? There's something I want to talk to you about." 9 o'clock. "Carla will let you up," She read the message 3 times. There were no details. Nothing about work or the restaurant. She wanted to refuse. The rational part of her said she should keep her distance, that things were already complicated enough, that she shouldn't be going to see this man at night in his building. But the other part, the part that had watched him sit down and draw a crooked house for her daughter, that part replied, "Okay," before reason had time to object. She left Mia with Mrs. Patricia, who had recovered, then took the subway to Midtown. Carla was waiting in the lobby, asked no questions, led her to the elevator, but not to the familiar floor. Instead, she swiped her card over the top button, marked R, and said, "Rooftop," then stepped back out, leaving Gianna alone in the elevator as it rose. When the doors opened, the Manhattan night wind rushed at her. Gianna stepped out onto a wide rooftop, dark wood beneath her feet, a few green planters, soft yellow string lights draped along the low railing, and beyond all of it, the city. Manhattan at night stretched beneath her like a carpet of light running all the way to the horizon. Millions of lit windows, car lights flowing in red and white rivers through the far streets below, and the skyline cutting across the deep violet sky with towers of blazing glass. Nico stood by the railing, his back to her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and it was the first time Gianna had seen him look as though he wasn't playing a role. "Thanks for coming," he said without turning around. Gianna walked over and stopped a few steps away from him, looking out at the city beside him. "What did you want to talk about?" Nico was silent for a while. He took a sip of whiskey. Then he spoke, his voice lower than usual, almost soft enough that only the two of them could hear. "My mother's name was Francesca." Gianna said nothing. She waited. She was the only person who ever called me by my first name. Not boss, not sir, not Mr. Valenti, just Nico. He turned the whiskey glass slowly in his hand, watching the city lights reflect in the amber liquid. "Everyone else, my whole life, they call me what they think I am. A title, a position, a threat. She called me who I was." Gianna felt her chest tighten. She remembered what he had told her in the office that day, briefly, about the night his mother was killed. But this was different. This wasn't an explanation. This was something he was opening, slowly, carefully, like reopening a wound that had scarred over a long time ago. "The night she died, I made a promise. Not to God, not to anyone, to myself. I swore I'd never be weak in front of another person again. Never let anyone see me break. Never let anyone get close enough to have that kind of power over me." He paused. The wind moved across the rooftop, carrying the distant sound of horns from below. 22 years. I kept that promise for 22 years. Then he turned and looked at her, and Gianna saw those eyes, the eyes she had seen cold, had seen dark, had seen dangerous, now looking at her with something she had no name for, but felt in her bones, "Until I saw you holding your daughter on that bench, crying, alone." Gianna stopped breathing. "You reminded me of her, of my mother, and I hated it, because it made me feel things I buried so deep I forgot they were there." Silence. Long. Heavy. The city glittered below them, but neither of them looked at it. "I'm not your mother," Gianna said, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't need you to save me." "I know," Nico said. No defense, no argument, just acknowledgement. "I know you're not her, and I know you don't need saving. You've been saving yourself your whole life." He took one step closer. Only one. "That's why I can't stop thinking about you." Gianna felt her heart beating in her throat. The air between them changed, thicker, warmer, even though the night wind was still cold. She looked at him and saw everything at once. The scar, the suit, the cold phone call at midnight, the crooked house drawn in crayon, the dark eyes looking at her now as if she were the only real thing on that rooftop. "You're dangerous," she said. "Yes, no denial, no explanation, just one word. I have a child." "I know." "Then don't look at me like that." Nico didn't look away. "Like what?" Gianna didn't answer. Because if she answered, she would have to admit that she knew exactly how he was looking at her, and she would have to admit that some part of her wanted him to keep looking that way, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. She stepped back. "I should go. It's late." Nico didn't follow, didn't tell her to stay, didn't try to stop her. He only stood there, whiskey in hand, the lights of Manhattan behind him, and watched her leave. Gianna stepped into the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and when the doors closed, she leaned back against the cold steel wall, closed her eyes, and felt her heart pounding so hard that her whole body seemed to shake with it. She didn't look back, but all the way home on the subway, all the way through the Bronx night wind, all the way through locking her door and lying down beside Mia, she could still feel those eyes on her, and she knew that no matter how afraid she was, no matter how many times she told herself that he was dangerous, that she had to keep her distance. Something had changed tonight on that rooftop, something she couldn't pull back apart anymore. 3 days passed after the night on the rooftop, and Gianna lived suspended between two things she didn't want to face. At Fontana, she worked as usual, professional, precise, composed. But every time Nico walked into the restaurant, the air between them grew so thick Carla had to pretend to be busy reading the books just to avoid looking up. Gianna didn't avoid him the way she had the week before, but she didn't let herself move any closer either. She answered when he asked something, nodded when necessary, and kept every exchange strictly within the boundaries of work with a discipline she had to force through every second. Nico didn't push. He came. He left. He looked at her with those eyes she tried not to meet, and between them, there was a thin, taut wire both of them pretended not to see. Thursday, 4:17 in the afternoon. Gianna left Fontana earlier than usual to pick Mia up from Little Sunshine Daycare on Crotona Avenue in the Bronx. She walked from the subway station, moving fast because the air was getting colder, and she wanted to get her daughter home before dark. She pushed open the glass door of the daycare, smiled at the teacher behind the reception desk, and said, "I'm here for Mia." The teacher looked at her, then looked down at the book, then looked back up, and on her face was an expression Gianna would remember for the rest of her life. "Miss Vale, Mia was picked up about 30 minutes ago. A man came in with a signed emergency authorization form and a copy of your ID. He said he was her uncle, and everything looked so official that we released her to him." Gianna didn't hear the rest of the sentence. Her ears rang, the floor tilted. The teacher was still talking. Something about, "He seemed legitimate, and we followed standard procedure, and is everything all right?" But those words were coming from very far away, as though from underwater, and the only thing Gianna could hear clearly was the sound of blood pounding inside her skull. Mia didn't have an uncle. Mia had no one except her and Tommy. And Tommy was at NYU. What did he look like? Gianna said, and her voice didn't sound like her own. Flat, empty, as if someone had stripped every emotion out of her in the last 3 seconds and left behind only the shell. The teacher described him. Middle-aged man, short hair, leather jacket, few words, knew Mia's full name and Gianna's home address, knew even Mrs. Patricia Webb's name, knew everything. Gianna stepped back outside. The streets of the Bronx were still normal. Traffic, pedestrians, music spilling from the shop on the corner. And that normalcy made her want to scream because her daughter wasn't here. Her daughter was somewhere out there with a man she didn't know, and the world was still turning as if nothing had happened. She called 911. Her voice shook, but she forced it into complete sentences. Her 3-year-old daughter had been taken from daycare by a stranger 30 minutes earlier. She didn't know who he was. She needed help immediately. The dispatcher said the call would be transferred to the police, that someone would contact her back, that she should stay where you are and we'll file a report. File a report. Her daughter was somewhere out there, maybe crying, maybe terrified, maybe calling for mama, and they were talking about filing a report. Gianna stood on the sidewalk with the phone in her hand, and she knew. She knew the police would take hours. She knew the system would do exactly what procedure required, slowly, step by step. While every second passing was another second, her daughter was farther away, and she knew there was exactly one person in this world who had the power to find Mia faster than any agency ever could. She opened her contacts. His name was there. She had saved it the night she first called him and had never deleted it. Her finger pressed call, and she didn't think about the rooftop, didn't think about the distance she had been trying to keep, didn't think about the fact that he was dangerous or who he was. She thought only of Mia. The phone rang once. Gianna, his voice, calm, as always. Nico, and her voice broke. Everything she had been holding together for the last 10 minutes, that flat, hollow shell, that control held together by sheer will, all of it collapsed in a single word. They took Mia. Someone took my daughter. Silence. 2 seconds. the longest 2 seconds of Gianna's life. Then Nico's voice changed. Not the voice from the rooftop, not the voice that had asked Carla, "How is she at Fontana?" This was another voice. Cold, precise, every word like a bullet already chambered. "Where are you?" Not a question mark. Not a question. An order. The daycare. Crotona Avenue, Bronx. "Don't move. I'm coming." He hung up. And Gianna stood there on the sidewalk on Crotona Avenue, one hand holding the phone, the other clenched so tightly into a fist her nails cut into her palm, and she waited. The wind moved down the Bronx street. The streetlights were beginning to come on, and somewhere out there, her daughter was without her. Gianna closed her eyes, forced the tears back in, and whispered into the cold air, "Mama's coming, baby. Mama's coming." 11 minutes. Gianna counted every minute because she didn't know what else to do besides count. 11 minutes after hanging up, 3 black SUVs turned onto Crotona Avenue, slicing through traffic like knives. No sirens, no flashing lights, just 3 blocks of black steel gliding to the curb in front of her with the precision of a formation that had practiced this move hundreds of times. The door of the first car opened, and Ray Santos stepped out, earpiece already in place, his eyes sweeping the street in less than 2 seconds. From the second car came 2 men in black Gianna had never seen before, moving fast and silently, spreading out along both sides of the sidewalk. From the third car came Nico. He stepped out, and Gianna looked at him and almost didn't recognize him, not because his appearance had changed, but because the air around him had. On the rooftop that night, he had been vulnerable. At Fontana, he had been polished. But now, on a Bronx sidewalk under the pale yellow wash of streetlights, Nico Valenti was the thing people only heard about in whispers and prayed they would never have to witness with their own eyes. He came toward her quickly, his gaze reading her from head to toe in a single second, confirming she wasn't hurt, then placing one hand on her shoulder, firm and brief, not to comfort her but to anchor her. "Get in the car. Tell me everything." Gianna climbed into the back seat of the middle SUV. Nico sat beside her. Ray Santos turned around from the front seat, and she told them, fast, concise, everything the daycare teacher had said, the description of the man, the time, the detail, that he had known Mrs. Patricia Webb's name. Nico listened, didn't ask her to repeat anything, didn't need clarification. He looked at Ray. "Frank." One word. Ray nodded, turned back around, and already had the phone to his ear. And the machine came alive. Gianna sat in the car and, for the first time in her life, witnessed what real power looked like. Not the kind of power in movies, not loud violence or guns or car chases, but telephones. Dozens of calls. Nico picked up his phone, and everything began to move. He called in Italian, his voice low and fast, though she couldn't understand the words. The sharp intensity in his eyes, and the way he barked the name of the daycare made his intent clear. He then switched to English, instructing someone to lock down every exit out of the Bronx that his network controlled, before returning to Italian for a final, heated command. She didn't need a translator to know he was unleashing a hunt that would cover every inch of the city until Frank was found. No call lasted more than 30 seconds. Every sentence was so brief it felt brutal. No one asked him to repeat himself. No one said why. Only "yes, boss," or silence before the line went dead. Ray Santos's phone never stopped either. He spoke to at least 5 different people in 10 minutes, his voice low enough that Gianna caught only a few words. But she saw the way his fingers tightened around the phone, and she understood the level of urgency. Gianna sat in the middle of it all, trembling, both hands clenched on her knees, listening to the current of power rushing around her like floodwater. She understood now, understood for real, not from articles or rumors, but with her own ears and eyes. Nico Valenti wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a system. He had eyes on every street, ears in every conversation, hands on every door. When he wanted to find someone in this city, the question wasn't if, it was when. Then Nico stopped, set the phone on his thigh, looked out the tinted window for 1 second, then picked it up again, pressed a number, and waited. Frank. His voice was calm in a way that made the hair rise on Gianna's arms, because no one could be that calm while speaking to the man who had just abducted a 3-year-old child, unless that calm was something infinitely more dangerous than rage. "The girl is 3 years old, Frank. 3. You know my rules. You've always known my rules." Silence. Frank was saying something on the other end, But Gianna couldn't hear it. She could only hear Nico. "You have 2 hours to bring her back, untouched. Not a scratch, not a bruise, not a single hair out of place." His voice didn't change in volume. Still low, still even, but every word landed with the weight of 22 years of accumulated power, of an empire, of hundreds of people ready to do whatever he said. "If one hair on that child's head is out of place, I won't kill you. That'd be mercy. And you know I don't do mercy, Frank. I'll make you wish you were dead every single day for the rest of your very, very long life." He hung up. Didn't wait for a reply. Didn't need one. Gianna looked at him. Her hands were still shaking, but she didn't look away. She looked straight at Nico Valenti's face, in the streetlight bleeding through the SUV window, and she saw him, saw all of him. Power, restrained violence, calculated cruelty. The darkness she had feared ever since the night she heard that cold phone call at Fontana. It was all there, in his face, in his voice, in the air inside the black SUV parked on a Bronx street. But all of it, every call, every order, every threat, every thread of power pulled tight across the whole city, was aimed at one single purpose: her daughter. Nico turned to look at her. "We'll get her back." It wasn't a promise. It was a fact. And Gianna, for the first time since hearing the daycare teacher say she was picked up 30 minutes ago, believed him. 87 minutes. Gianna knew the exact number because she looked at the clock on her phone every 30 seconds. And each time she looked, it felt as though time slowed down just to punish her. 87 minutes sitting inside the black SUV on a Bronx street, listening to Nico's phone ring and ring and ring, listening to Ray Santos murmur into his earpiece, listening to the sound of her own breathing, and wondering if her daughter was crying, if she was calling for Mama, if she was terrified. Nico sat beside her through all 87 of those minutes. He said nothing, didn't promise it would be all right, didn't touch her. He just sat there, phone in hand, eyes scanning every message that came in, and now and then giving an order in a few clipped words. He didn't show worry, but Gianna saw his left hand, the one not holding the phone, clenched tight on his thigh, his fingers pressing so hard together that his knuckles had gone white. At minute 82, Ray's phone vibrated. He answered, said 2 words in Italian, then turned to Nico. "Got her. She's safe. My guys are bringing her now." Gianna heard it, and still didn't believe it. She didn't dare believe it until she saw her with her own eyes. 5 minutes later, another black SUV pulled up in front of them. The back door opened. A man Gianna didn't know stepped out, and in his arms, small, curly-haired, face red from crying, eyes swollen, both little hands clutching the collar of the man carrying her, was Mia. Gianna didn't remember opening the car door, didn't remember stepping out, didn't remember her feet touching the ground. She only remembered the sound of her daughter's voice. "Mama." That sound tore through everything Gianna had been holding together for 87 minutes. She took Mia from the man's arms, crushed her against her chest, and her knees gave out. She collapsed right there on the sidewalk, both arms wrapped around Mia so tightly the little girl cried harder. But Gianna couldn't let go. Couldn't, because if she let go, someone would take her again. "Mama's here. Mama's here. I'm here. I'm here." She repeated it over and over, her mouth pressed into her daughter's hair, tears spilling down over those curls, and she cried. Not the quiet tears she had cried in the park. Real crying. Crying from the deepest place in her chest. The kind of crying she hadn't known she still had left in her. The kind of crying that comes from a mother who has just gotten back the only thing in the world that matters. Mia clung to her neck, her tiny hands gripping her shirt, her wet face buried in her mother's shoulder, and she kept repeating one word, only one word. "Mama, Mama, Mama," as if it were the only spell she knew to keep the world from falling apart. Nico stood 4 steps away. He had stepped out of the car at some point. Gianna didn't know when. He stood there on the Bronx sidewalk, black suit, back straight, face expressionless, but his hands were clenched at his sides, and Gianna, even while crying, even while holding her daughter, somehow still saw it. The scar on his hand had gone pale from the force of his grip, paler than the streetlight falling over it, and he stood there like a man who wanted to step forward but wouldn't allow himself to, because he thought she would be afraid. After everything she had just witnessed in those 87 minutes, the calls, the orders, the threat he had delivered to Frank in a voice colder than steel, He thought she was looking at him now and seeing a monster. So he stayed where he was, 4 steps away, far enough not to invade, close enough for her to know he was there. Gianna looked up, eyes red, face wet with tears. Mia still clinging to her neck, still whispering, "Mama." And Gianna looked at Nico Valenti, the man she had feared, the man she had kept her distance from, the man she had walked away from on that rooftop because he was dangerous. And she said 2 words, "Come here." Nico didn't move, as if he didn't believe he had heard correctly, as if no one in this world had ever said those 2 words to him that way. Not as an order, not as a request, but as an invitation, the kind you only give to someone you want near you. "Come here, Nico." He stepped forward, slowly. 1 step, 2, 3, 4, and when he stood right in front of her, Gianna reached out one hand, took hold of his wrist, the scarred one, the hand that was trembling even though he was trying to hide it, and pulled him down. Nico dropped to one knee on a Bronx sidewalk, and Gianna held both him and Mia, one arm around her daughter, one arm around the neck of the man this entire city spoke of with fear, and she pulled him close, held on tight, as if by holding hard enough, she could keep both of them from a world that kept trying to tear them apart. Nico didn't cry. Valenti men don't cry. 22 years without crying, and tonight wasn't an exception. But his hands were shaking so clearly Gianna could feel it through the fabric of his shirt, and he placed one hand against Mia's back, gently, as if he were afraid she might break, and she felt his fingers curl into the little girl's shirt, holding on, the way a drowning man grabs the only thing still floating on the surface. 3 people, on a sidewalk, at night, in the middle of the Bronx. Gianna didn't know how long they stayed that way. Maybe a minute, maybe 10, maybe a lifetime. That night, Frank Del Vecchio left New York. No one knew how. No one knew where he went. There were no newspaper stories, no police reports, no trace. Just one morning when his apartment in Queens was empty, his phone was dead, and the name Frank Del Vecchio vanished from every conversation in the New York underworld as if it had never existed. Gianna didn't ask. She didn't need to know. She only needed to know that her daughter was asleep in her arms, safe, and that the man who had brought her back was standing outside the door of her Bronx apartment, waiting until she locked it before he turned away. Nico didn't ask. He didn't offer. He told her, "You're not going back to that apartment tonight, or tomorrow. You and Mia stay at my place until I know it's safe." Gianna wanted to argue. The stubborn part of her, the part that had taken care of herself and her younger brother her whole life, wanted to say no, wanted to say she could handle it, wanted to prove that she didn't need anyone to protect her. But then she looked down at Mia asleep in her arms, the little girl's fingers still clutching a fold of her shirt even in sleep, and that part of her went quiet. Because this wasn't about her, this was about her daughter, and the thin door of that Bronx studio couldn't keep anything out. She nodded. The car took them to Nico's penthouse on the Upper East Side. Gianna stepped inside, and the apartment was larger than the entire 3rd floor of the building where she lived in the Bronx put together. High ceilings, dark wood floors, furniture so minimal and expensive she knew she was standing in a space worth more than everything she would earn in her lifetime. But she didn't care about any of it. She only needed a safe place for Mia to sleep. Nico led her to a bedroom at the end of the hall. The bed had already been made, clean towels folded on the pillow, the bedside lamp casting a soft golden light. Gianna realized. Carla had prepared it before they arrived. On the bed there was also a smaller pillow and a thin, pale pink blanket that Gianna was certain Nico hadn't already had in the apartment. Someone had bought it. Today. For Mia. She laid her daughter down on the bed, took off her shoes, and pulled the blanket over her. Mia shifted, her eyes opening halfway before closing again, whispered, "Mama," one more time, then fell into a deep sleep. Gianna sat beside her daughter's bed for 10 minutes, listening to the steady rise and fall of her breathing, counting each breath, proving to herself that her little girl was here, alive, safe, unhurt. Then she stood and stepped back out. The penthouse was dark. The hallway lights had been turned off, and only the glow of the city came through the wide windows, spilling silver-blue shadows across the wood floors and the walls. Gianna walked down the hall toward the living room and saw him. Nico was sitting in a single armchair by the glass, no lights on, a whiskey glass in his hand but nearly full, which meant he hadn't been drinking it, only holding it. He was looking out at Manhattan, the skyline glittering beyond the glass, but his eyes weren't really seeing the city. Gianna knew that look. She had seen it in the park on the first day. The look of someone who was somewhere else, in the past, in some place that hurt. She should have gone back to the room. She should have closed the door, slept beside her daughter, let distance remain distance. But her feet didn't turn back. She walked into the living room, and Nico heard her. He didn't turn, but his shoulders shifted slightly, registering her presence. "I'm not a good man, Gianna." His voice was low, not the voice of a boss, not the voice that had given orders inside the SUV a few hours earlier. This was the voice of a man sitting alone in the dark at 2 a.m, telling the truth to an empty room because there was no one there to hear it. But tonight she was there. "I know," she said. "My world will never be safe. There'll always be someone. Another Frank, another threat, another war. That's what this life is." "I know. Then why are you still here?" She moved closer. The city lights painted half his face, while the other half stayed buried in shadow, and Gianna thought it was the truest image of Nico Valenti she had ever seen. Half light, half dark, and she had seen both. "Because for the first time in my life, I feel like someone actually sees me," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't break. Each word fell with certainty, as if she had known this answer for a long time and was only now allowing herself to say it. "Not pity me, not rescue me, not use me, see me." Silence. Nico turned his head and looked at her. The whiskey glass was still in his hand, and his eyes, the eyes she had seen cold, dark, dangerous, the eyes she had seen soften while Mia drew, were now looking at her with something Gianna recognized because she was feeling it too. Not desire, not gratitude, something deeper, more painful, more real. Nico set the whiskey down on the table beside him, slowly. Then he stood. He walked to her and stopped in front of her. Close, closer than they had ever been before. Close enough that she could smell the untouched whiskey and oak, and something else that belonged only to him. He lifted his hand, slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted. His fingers touched her face, gentle, his thumb brushing away the dried trace of tears on her cheek that she hadn't even known was still there. "I see you too," he said, a whisper, as if saying it louder might break something. Gianna didn't step back, didn't walk away, didn't say, "You're dangerous." She already knew he was dangerous. She had seen the darkness in him, and she had seen the light too, in the crooked house drawn in crayon, in the respectful nod whenever she entered a room, in the 87 minutes spent turning the whole city upside down to bring her daughter back. She tilted her face up. He bent down. And when their lips met, it wasn't like any kiss in movies or books or in Gianna's imagination. It was slow, heavy, full of the weight of everything that had happened since that autumn afternoon on the bench in Central Park. Not romantic in the fairy tale way, not sweet in the first-time way. This was the kiss of two people who had been broken in different ways and somehow found each other in the middle of the wreckage. Nico placed one hand at her waist, not pulling, not pressing, only resting it there, the way he had always been with her, giving her room, giving her the right to walk away whenever she wanted. But Gianna didn't walk away. She stepped closer. Her hand caught the collar of his shirt and pulled him nearer, and she kissed him as if this were the only thing left in the world that still meant anything on the longest night of her life. When they finally broke apart, forehead to forehead, breath mingling, Nico whispered, "Stay." One word. And it didn't mean stay tonight. It meant stay. Stay here, in this world, in this darkness, with him. Gianna closed her eyes. She could hear his heart beating beneath her palm. Fast, hard. The heart of the man all New York feared beating as if it had never been allowed to beat freely until now. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Gianna called Tommy the next morning. She didn't tell him everything. She didn't tell him about Frank, about the debt, about the months of threats. She only said that something had happened with Mia, that the little girl was safe now, but that she needed her brother to come up to New York and see her, and that she needed to tell him a few things she should have told him a long time ago. Tommy took the train up from NYU to Midtown in 40 minutes. Gianna had sent him the penthouse address, and she knew the moment Tommy saw the building, the questions would start. She wasn't wrong. Tommy called her while standing in the lobby downstairs, his voice tighter than usual. "Gianna, there's a guy at the door who looks like he could snap me in half. Where the hell are you?" She told him to come up, that security would let him into the elevator. She heard Tommy take one sharp breath and hang up, and she knew her younger brother, the 19-year-old boy smarter than most people she had ever met, was already starting to put together the pieces she had hidden for months. The elevator doors opened, and Tommy stepped out. Tall, thin, wearing an NYU hoodie and jeans, backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes moving quickly over the penthouse hallway, with the look of someone assessing a threat without knowing what shape that threat might take. She was waiting for him at the entrance to the living room. Tommy looked at her, looked at the penthouse behind her, looked at the black SUV parked on the street below that he had passed on the way in, looked at the 2 bodyguards standing at either end of the hallway, and his face changed. No longer worry for his sister. Now it was something else. Wariness, fear, anger. Whose place is this? Not a question. More like an accusation. Come inside, Tommy. I'll explain. Explain now. Whose place is this? Gianna took a breath. His name is Nico Valenti. He's the one who gave me the job, and he's the one who saved Mia. Tommy stood still for 3 seconds, then pulled out his phone. She knew he was searching the name because she had done the exact same thing, sitting on the floor of her Bronx studio in the middle of the night, with shaking hands and her stomach turning inside out. She watched Tommy's eyes red, saw the color drain from his face little by little, saw his jaw tighten, saw his fingers curl hard around the phone. Mafia. Tommy said the word in a voice so flat it was almost frightening. He's Mafia, Gianna. He's literally Mafia. The Valenti family. It's right here. FBI investigations, racketeering, murder. It's all right here. He looked up from the phone and his eyes were red, not from crying but from fury. What are you doing? What are you thinking? You have a daughter, Gianna. You have Mia. And you're living in a mob boss's penthouse? Gianna didn't get defensive, didn't raise her voice, didn't shout back. She had prepared for this conversation from the moment she pressed call that morning, and she knew every word he was saying was true, was exactly what any normal person would say, and he had every right to say it. Sit down, Tommy. Please. I don't want to sit down. Then stand. But let me talk. Tommy folded his arms across his chest, his back against the hallway wall, not stepping into the living room, as if stepping inside would mean accepting something. And Gianna told him. This time she told him everything. About Derek and the debt, about Frank Del Vecchio and the threatening messages, about the picture of Mia at daycare, about the photograph of her apartment door, about the 6 months she had spent living in fear without saying a word to him because she didn't want him to worry, because she wanted him focused on school, because she thought she could handle it, about the afternoon in the park, about the black card, about the arrangement, and about the night before, when someone had picked Mia up from daycare and Gianna had called 911 and they said they would file a report. Tommy didn't interrupt. His face turned paler as he heard about the debt, went even whiter when he heard about the photograph of the door. And when Gianna reached the part about Mia being taken, he sank down onto the hallway floor, as if his legs couldn't hold him anymore. Gianna sat down across from him. He's the only one who got her back, Tommy. The police said they'd file a report. File a report. My daughter was gone, and they said they'd file a report. Her voice didn't break. She had cried enough already. Now she was only telling the truth. Nico Valenti made one phone call, and 87 minutes later my daughter was in my arms. You can hate him. You can refuse to accept this. But you don't get to deny what he did. Tommy sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the dark wood floor, both arms wrapped around his knees, and Gianna could see her 19-year-old brother fighting with himself, caught between logic telling him this was wrong, and reality telling him that his sister had survived only because of the man that logic insisted she should stay far away from. Then Mia's voice drifted in from the living room. Mama, look, I drew a house. Tommy looked up, looked through the living room doorway. Mia was sitting on the floor, crayons scattered all around her, holding up a sheet of paper with a crooked house on it and a sun almost as large as the roof. She was smiling, radiant, peaceful, safe. Gianna saw Tommy's eyes stop on his niece, stay there a long moment. Then he looked down the opposite side of the hallway, where Nico was standing. Gianna didn't know when he had gotten there, maybe from the beginning, maybe he had heard everything, but he hadn't stepped in. He stood in the hallway with his back against the wall, both arms folded across his chest, giving the brother and sister space, not interrupting, not defending himself, not trying to impress anyone, just standing there and letting Gianna say what she needed to say. Tommy looked at Nico. Nico looked back. No nod, no smile, no hand extended for a shake. Just a look. Straight. Honest. As if saying with his eyes that I am exactly who you read about on Google. I'm not denying it. But your sister and your niece are safe. And that is the only truth that matters right now. Tommy got to his feet. Brushed off his jeans. Looked at Gianna. I don't like this, he said. His voice was low, tired. Like someone who had just lost an argument he knew he was right about, but reality didn't care. I know, Gianna said. But she's safe. Tommy looked at Mia one more time. Then he walked toward the exit. Past Nico. Stopped. Didn't turn his head. But he nodded. Once. Small. Almost invisible. Then stepped into the elevator. Nico said nothing. Didn't go after him. Didn't try to explain himself. He only watched the elevator doors slide shut, then turned to Gianna. She looked at him, tired, relieved, aching, all at once. That's enough for now, she said. Nico nodded. And he understood, because he was a man who knew that sometimes a small nod in passing isn't acceptance, but it is a beginning. And a beginning is enough. 3 years later, Gianna Valenti stood in front of the mirror in her private office on the 2nd floor of Fontana, straightening the collar of her blazer and looking at the face staring back at her. 28 years old when she sat crying on that park bench. 31 now. The same woman. And yet completely changed. On her desk lay 7 folders. 1 for each restaurant. 5 in New York, 2 in Miami, all belonging to the Fontana group she had built from a single Soho location into a culinary empire that Eater called one of the most quietly influential restaurant groups on the East Coast. She built it with skill, with late nights spent reading ledgers, with 14-hour shifts on her feet without rest, with the ability to read a room, read people, and solve a crisis before anyone even realized there was one. Carla Montero, now deputy group manager, told every new employee the same sentence. She earned every inch of that office. Don't let the last name fool you. Because yes, she carried the Valenti name now. But no one in the New York restaurant world thought Gianna Valenti stood where she stood because of her husband's name. They knew. Everyone knew. Mia was 6. She attended a good school on the Upper East Side, the kind with a wide playground and teachers who addressed parents as Mr. and Mrs., and security fencing that Nico had personally inspected before agreeing to let his daughter go there. Mia still loved to draw. Her bedroom was filled with coloring pages and crayons and crooked houses that were a little less crooked now than they had been in the beginning. And one evening last month, when Nico came home after a late meeting, Mia ran into the hallway, wrapped herself around his legs, tilted her face up, and said, "Daddy, look what I drew for you." Daddy. Not Nico. Not the tall man the way she had called him when they first met. Daddy. Gianna stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. Nico went still, his arms falling to his sides, looking down at the 6-year-old curly-haired little girl holding up her drawing for him, and on his usually unreadable face, something cracked open. He bent down, took the paper, said, "It's beautiful, sweetheart," in a normal voice, then stood and walked quickly into his study and closed the door. Gianna didn't follow. She waited 5 minutes, then knocked softly, opened the door, and found Nico standing by the window with his back to her, his hand clenched around the drawing. His eyes were red. His hand was shaking. Valenti men don't cry. 25 years without crying. But that day, he almost did. Gianna walked over and wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Tommy graduated from NYU in May with honors in cybersecurity. He took a job at a cybersecurity consulting firm in Manhattan. Good salary, fully independent, with nothing to do with the Valenti empire. That was the line all 3 of them respected without ever needing to say it aloud. But every Sunday night, Tommy came to the penthouse for dinner. He played with Mia, argued with Gianna that her pasta was still worse than Fontana's chef's, and when Nico stepped into the room, Tommy stood, shook his hand firmly, met his eyes, and called him by name. Nico. Not sir, not boss. Nico. The kind of unspoken respect both men understood the value of more than any words could ever explain. Gianna was 7 months pregnant. A boy. She and Nico had already chosen his name. Paolo Vale Valenti. Paolo, after Nico's father, the man who built the empire his son inherited. Vale, his mother's family name, the name Gianna had carried through the hardest years of her life, the name she wanted her son to carry with him as a reminder of where he came from. This afternoon was Sunday, October, Central Park. Gianna sat on that bench, the exact same bench. 3 years ago, she had sat there holding Mia and crying, not knowing what tomorrow would look like. Now she sat there 7 months pregnant, wedding ring on her finger, watching 6-year-old Mia run around the fountain a few yards away, laughing breathlessly when the water splashed onto her shoes. Nico sat beside her. Black suit. Always the black suit. But his shirt was open 2 buttons instead of 1, and on his lap was a drawing Mia had forced him to keep before she ran off to play. "Do you remember the first time?" Gianna asked, her eyes following Mia. "Every second," Nico said. "You were crying, holding her, and I was supposed to walk past. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." Silence. Wind moved through the trees. Yellow leaves drifting slowly across the grass. The October afternoon light slanted through the branches exactly the way it had that day 3 years ago, as if time remembered and was replaying the same scene with a different ending. "Why?" Gianna asked. "Why did you stop?" Nico looked at the 6-year-old little girl waving at him from the fountain, then looked down at his wife's pregnant belly, then into her eyes. "For the first time in 22 years, I stopped." He spoke slowly, as if weighing every word. "I don't know why. I was supposed to come here, sit on this bench, remember my mother, and leave. That was it. Every year, for 22 years, that was it. But then I saw you, and something broke." Gianna rested her head on his shoulder, his right hand, the one with the scar across the knuckles, the scar from the world she knew about but never asked about. That hand settled lightly over her belly, feeling their son kick inside. His left hand, the one with the wedding ring, slipped around her shoulder and drew her closer. Mia came running back, climbed into Nico's lap, cheeks flushed from running, hair a tangled halo of curls, smiling wide through the gap in her little teeth. "Daddy, the water went really high." "Yeah? Show me." She tugged him to his feet and pulled him toward the fountain by one finger. Gianna stayed on the bench, watching them, watching the man all of New York spoke of with fear let himself be led away by a 6-year-old girl holding his little finger, watching her daughter laugh, watching the curve of her own stomach, where her son was growing in safety. And she thought that sometimes it is in the middle of darkness that you find the truest light. Not bright fairy tale light, but the light of 2 candles that had once gone out finding a way to relight each other. She thought that 3 years ago, on this autumn afternoon, on this bench, when she sat crying alone with her little girl in her arms and nothing left but fear, that wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of everything. And that is also where Gianna and Nico's story ends. But before we stop, there is one thing I want to say to you. Life sometimes pushes us into the darkest corners, the places where we think there is no way out, no one who cares, no reason left to keep going. But this story reminds us that all it takes is one moment, one person who stops and asks, "Are you okay?" And everything can change. That kindness, even when it comes from the last place you would expect, is still kindness. That true strength isn't never falling, but falling and still getting up every morning for the people you love. And that sometimes, the right person arriving at the right moment isn't a miracle, but the reward for those who don't give up even when life gives them every reason to. If this story touched your heart even a little, I want to hear what you felt. Have you ever met someone who changed your life with one small act? Have you ever been the one who stopped for someone when the rest of the world kept walking? Share your story in the comments, because I believe every one of us carries a story worth telling, and I want to hear yours from the deepest part of your heart. If you liked this video, please press the like button and share it with someone you think needs to hear this story today. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now so you don't miss the moving stories we bring you every day. Thank you for being here, for listening all the way to the very end. I wish you and the people you love good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and I will see you again in the next video.